Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents An Alternative History of Britain, The Anglo-Saxon Age, by Timothy Venning, narrated by Gerrard. Introduction. One of the few dates from medieval British history still firmly in the popular memory is 1066. The end of Anglo-Saxon England and the Norman conquest are still viewed as major events. England's forcible first entry into Europe. Its somewhat isolated socio-political structure was integrated into the world of Western European Latin-speaking Christendom and what is loosely described as feudalism. The victor, Duke William of Normandy, known, though not to his face, as the Bastard, rather than the late sobriquet, the Conqueror, had no serious claim on the throne, though he did his best to claim that the late King Edward, not known then as the Confessor, had named him as heir, and the intervening king, Harold Godwinson, was an oath-breaking usurper. The kings after the conquest numbered themselves as from 1066, not from English unification in the 1920s. Edward I, reigned 1272 to 1307, was in fact the fourth Edward to rule England, starting with the national unifier Edward the Elder, reigned 899 to 924. The work of the unification of England took place with the northwards expansion of the allied kingdoms of Edward's Wessex and his sister Ethelfleda's Mercia into the Danelaw, East Midlands and East Anglia, settled by Danish incomers in the 870s, in 911 to 18, and by 924 Edward was recognised as overlord by the Danish kingdom of York and the Norse settlers in Lancashire. He secured Mercia too on his sister's death in 918, and York was incorporated into England in 927, though it subsequently revolted and was not finally annexed until 954. Cumbria, independent but linked to Strathclyde in Scotland, was partly overrun in 945, but modern Cumberland only appears to have been annexed in 1092. The shifting Anglo-Scottish border in the east moved south from the Forth to its present position in the 970s. The creation of a Kingdom of England was thus far from straightforward, and there was no tradition of a united Anglo-Saxon Kingdom of England, so Mercian and Northumbrian regional separatism remained an issue. Edward's annexation of Mercia in 918 was immensely aided by the fact that its heir, his niece, Egwin, was a girl who could not lead armies, and there was no male candidate available. Even so, his eldest son, Athelstan, brought up in Mercia and the offspring of a legally questionable marriage, was passed over for Wessex, and seems to have been intended to rule Mercia. He only secured Wessex when his half-brother, Elfwerd, died weeks after Edward in 924. The fact that he was not crowned for a year implies serious resistance to this. Had Elfwerd not died, would England have remained united? Similarly, it is possible that Athelstan's half-brother and successor, Edmund, intended both his sons, Edwy and Edgar, to rule a kingdom each when they were adult. Edwy succeeded to both in 955, but in 957 Mercia and Northumbria revolted in Edgar's favour. Edwy's death in 959 saw unity restored, but was this inevitable? The succession to Edgar in 975 was disputed between partisans of his two underage sons, Edward and Ethelred, though division was avoided, and in 978 Edward was murdered. In the 1000s, England was gradually overrun by a Viking army under Svein Forkbeard, King of Denmark, a war that could have seen England split into two again, with him ruling the Danelaw and Northumbria, which were first to accept him. As Wessex rallied against the Danes under Athelred's son Edmund Ironside in 1016, the latter's defeat at Ashington saw England divided between him and Sven's son Canute, though this was probably only a truce born of exhaustion, and Edmund quickly died. A temporary division between the partisans of Canute's two sons, Harold Harefoot and Harthacnut, followed Canute's death in 1035, though that was soon reversed, as first one, then the other took control, and in 1066 King Harold Hadradi of Norway endeavoured to add York, and perhaps more, to his wide-flung domains. After Harold was killed by Harold Godwinson, the latter fell in battle against Duke William within weeks, but a less decisive result could have left England divided again, as in 1016. The triumph of one state in England was far from certain throughout this period, and was due to genetic and military luck rather than inevitability. The what-ifs of English unification are thus many, and pose possibilities of a future for England radically different from reality. And what if the Wessex of Alfred the Great had succumbed to Viking invasion in the battle winter of 870–71, or the surprise attack of winter 877–78? What if Alfred, a fourth if not fifth son, had never been king? What if two heirs had succeeded in 924, 955–59, or 975? What if Edmund had defeated Canute in 1016? What if Canute had not died relatively young in 1035, or both his sons had not died in their 20s? What if Edward the Confessor had had a son, or his nephew and chosen heir, Edward the Exile, had not died in 1057? Earl Harold Godwinson would have stood little chance of the throne in either case, and Duke William even less. Events cast a long shadow. If the English elite had not been decimated by the Wars of the 1000s and Canute's takeover, King Edward would not have had his political power circumscribed as of 1042 by three powerful earls, all nominees of Canute, who could call on more military resources than he could. Even if Harold's father, Godwin, had still been chief minister, as in reality, when Edward exiled him in 1051, he would have been unlikely to have fought his way back to power, and again, Harold would never have been in a position to succeed as king in 1066. The same applies to events before the Viking invasions, which began in 865, though here the evidence is less clear, particularly before circa 650, and much has to be guesswork. Basic questions of political and social development have to be asked. Why did pre-850 England consist of so many petty kingdoms when the incoming Germanic peoples, conquerors or settlers, managed to create one state in Francia? The notion of a stable heptarchy of 7 English kingdoms has now been disproved, and it is clear that there were 3 major states, Northumbria, Mercia, and Wessex, plus numerous smaller ones, some of which were temporarily or permanently absorbed by their larger neighbours. But what determined which kingdoms succeeded? Geography, greater resources, military structure, or a coherent, dynamic and long-lasting tradition of leadership transmitted successfully from one generation to the next over centuries? The era of settlement and conquest is particularly disputed, and the notion of monolithic ethnic cleansing of Romano-Britons by invading Germans is now thought far too simplistic. Possibly peaceful farmers and traders were as crucial as the traditional picture of war bands and heroic leaders played up by literary tradition. But it is clear that leadership was crucial, and in the initial century or two of state formation, dynamic war leaders and statesmen briefly brought leadership of coalitions of smaller kingdoms to states which were later eclipsed, such as Kent, Sussex, and East Anglia. Those larger and better resourced states which soon emerged to prominence, particularly the Big Three, had turbulent histories rather than a smooth rise to power, with the dominance of first one and then another, secured and then lost by military means. Wessex, Northumbria, and Mercia all achieved temporary dominance within their regions, only to lose it again by dynastic luck, military misjudgment, or a coalition of their enemies. Northumbria was eclipsed temporarily by Mercia after military defeat in 642–55, and permanently after defeat by the Picts in 685, which later battle ended the chance of a northern English state encompassing much of Scotland. Wessex, dominant in the south, was eclipsed twice, after 592 and 688. Would Mercia, the leading state through the 8th and early 9th centuries under Ethelbald, Offa the Great and Coenwulf have lost its dominance to Wessex after 825 if its succession had been more stable? Could a stable Mercia, under long-lived rulers, succeeded by competent sons, have prevented the rise of Wessex under Alfred's grandfather, Egbert? And but for the Viking invasions, would Wessex have ever united England? The possible permutations of events, given different leadership choices or luck, are many, and indeed the limited evidence does not prevent us speculating that Anglo-Saxon rule of all England was not inevitable. What if one or more of the post-Roman British states had held on to more of its territory in the 6th or 7th centuries? Chapter 1. Early Anglo-Saxon Kingdoms to circa 800. Part 1. The Setting. An era of personal leadership and creation of new kingdoms. But what if the fortunes of war and politics had turned out differently? A. The problem of the sources. It has become the fashion in recent decades to emphasize the development of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of early England in terms of social and economic factors, as opposed to their leadership. The 19th century historian's enthusiasm for history, focusing on the lives of kings and queens, has been downplayed, and in school education, the old system of learning the names of rulers by rote has been replaced by empathizing with the lives of their subjects, the ordinary peasant farmers and their families. Assisted by a concentration of resources on archaeology and the excavation of homesteads, the basic details of everyday life have been the mainstay of pre-1066 studies. The complicated details of politics and battles have been neglected, with the additional factor that greater modern understanding of the meagre literary sources poses new questions about them. Just how accurate and reliable are the surviving, often non-contemporary narratives? To what extent were they written to record details that had been faithfully remembered over generations? And how much were they works of literature and propaganda with a contemporary political purpose? The issue is particularly acute for the era of conquest, itself a problematic concept at variance with basic archaeology, and settlement, the 5th to 7th centuries. The main semi-contemporary British, Welsh source, the De Excidio Britanniae of Gildas, 540s, deals in lurid generalizations of mass slaughter and polemic about the sins of the British, and its author clearly saw himself as a latter-day Jeremiah, inveighing against the moral failings of his sinful countrymen that led to merited punishment. He was not writing as an objective historian in the modern sense, or even as a Roman writer such as Tacitus did, but as a polemicist looking to the Old Testament for inspiration. The post-Roman British of his era had lost the greater part of their land to heathen invaders, just as the Jews of Jeremiah's time had lost Israel and were in the process of losing Judah. The parallel was obvious. The cause of this punishment of God's people must be their sins, and thus Gildas, a devout monk, probably writing in southern Britain or Brittany, was bound to play up the extent of the disaster. But his claims of disaster for the British, with towns sacked and farms abandoned in a systematic and countrywide reign of terror by Germanic invaders, are not backed by the evidence on the ground. The amount of fire-related destruction in towns is limited, and it has been pointed out that not every fire can be attributed to attackers, as opposed to accident, which happens to burnt Roman villas too. Pioneering work on the rural landscape shows a major degree of continuity in occupation from post-Roman to Anglo-Saxon settlement, and little sign of devastated farms left vacant for decades. The first English source, the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, was written by another monk, the Venerable Bede, in isolated Northumbria, circa 731, and sought to describe the inevitable triumph of the Roman Catholic missionaries in converting the English. Bede's monastery of Jarrow on the Tyne in northern Northumbria, around 700, was not that remote from events elsewhere despite the geographical location. The kingdom had many contacts with the other English states and bishoprics, and the nearer continent, playing up its role as part of Christendom and its links with the papacy in Rome, particularly under the late 7th century bishopric of the energetic Romanizer St. Wilfrid. Its elite, under King Oswy, had made a conscious decision to adopt the Roman religious customs, for example in celebrating Easter at Whitby in 664, to fit in with the continent, and the Church kept up its international links. Indeed, from 669, the Church in England uniquely had a Greek leader from St. Paul's hometown in Sicilia, eastern Anatolia, Archbishop Theodore from Tarsus. Bede was an assiduous collector of facts and emphasized his use of reliable witnesses, but he had a religious purpose in his writing as much as Gildas had, though he seems to have been less credulous about early history and better informed. His account downplayed both the work of Celtic missionaries from Iona, the defeated faction in 664, in the conversion of northern Britain and the survival of the post-Roman British Church. If he is to be believed, pre-conversion England was entirely pagan, with no mention of the possibility that Christians using churches, for example that of St. Martin at Canterbury, had survived in the Kingdom of Kent into the 6th century. No Christians were referred to in the British kingdoms of the Pennines annexed to Northumbria in the early 7th century. Nor did he point out that, before his hero, St. Augustine, and his missionaries arrived from Rome to convert Kent in 597, that King Athelbert's Christian Frankish wife already had an attendant bishop, Liudhard. Both Kent and Northumbria were presented as a pagan tabula rasa when their Roman Christian converters arrived, Augustine in Kent and Paulinus in Northumbria. In secular matters, Bede's list of the major over-kings in England in the 7th century, the Bretwaldus, notably left out of the pagan Penda, ruler of the Midlands from circa 625 to 655, and probably more powerful than his Northumbrian contemporaries. The major secular source for pre-900 history, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, was not compiled until the later 9th century, 400 years after the early settlements, and concentrates on events in its home territory, Wessex. It was probably commissioned by King Alfred's court, at a time of renewed threat from the Vikings, to present an inspiring picture of the struggles of the English peoples against the British, and each other, and to play up the role of Alfred's own dynasty. Much of its early detail is formulaic, with the sparse account of the conquest of Wessex suspiciously similar to that of Kent. The only other southern kingdom covered in any detail is Kent, and that mainly at the time of its conquest in the 5th century and the conversion in the 6th century. Sussex, adjacent to Wessex, so presumably reasonably well known to the latter's annalists, is only mentioned during its conquest in the 5th century, and later when its history impinges on Wessex. East Anglia, an important realm, holder of the Bretwaldship in the 620s and location of the major archaeological find of royal treasure at Sutton Hoo, is hardly mentioned, as is Essex. Mercia, crucial in the 7th and 8th centuries and arguably the most powerful kingdom south of the Humber from its unification, circa 630, is neglected, except when its history impinges on Wessex or Northumbria. As with Bede, the career of the pagan Penda is downplayed compared with that of his Christian foes in Northumbria, because Alfred, or other editors, regarded him with disapproval. The annals are very much history from a West Saxon point of view, and we must bear in mind that they may have been collected to inspire the readership and listeners about past heroic successes in an era of Viking attacks. As has been pointed out, there is no mention of apparent Saxon disasters, such as their defeat by the British at Mount Badon around 500. There is merely a suspicious lacuna in the list of Saxon military successes for the period of 491 to 560, except in Wessex. Again, there are contradictions with the archaeological record, particularly over the early settlement of Hampshire, the alleged cradle of Wessex. There is no archaeological record of a Saxon settlement in Hampshire around 500, when the founder, Cerdic, was apparently active. The majority of 6th century settlements are in the upper and middle Thames Valley, an area whose warfare is not covered in the Chronicle, except for a few references in the 570s. For that matter, even the early Welsh sources have been shown to have contemporary political purposes, as with the history attributed to Nennius, circa 829, commissioned for a new dynasty in Gwynedd to play up its predecessor's heroism, and the 10th century Annales Cambriae, compiled at Hywel Dda's court. Skeptics have accordingly had a field day minimizing the reliability of all these sources and limiting the amount of written evidence for the period that can be deemed reliable. It is likely that the sources are not as useless as some historians have implied, and that much detail was copied from non-surviving records without much amendation, even if a political spin was put upon it and inconvenient facts were dropped from the record. But it still provides a major note of caution when any assessment of the era of settlement is considered. And for that matter, the first 19th century modern historians to interpret this evidence had their own agenda too. Great progressive Whig historians, such as Freeman and Stubbs, had a motive for presenting a picture of free, racially Germanic Anglo-Saxons creating a distinctly English society without inconvenient Celtic elements. They looked to emulate their 19th century German contemporaries across the German Ocean, North Sea, whence the Anglo-Saxons had come, and to create a founding saga for the British Empire and its democratic institutions. In this respect, the Celtic element in Britain was an irrelevance, and any notion of non-Saxon survival in England to be ignored. The argument sometimes took on ominous racial overtones about the innate superiority of the Germanic Saxons to other peoples. In this interpretation, the 17th century left-wing notion of the post-1066 ruling class as alien Frenchmen imposing a Norman yoke on freedom-loving Saxons was revived. A typical interpretation was that of the historical novelist Charles Kingsley, of the career of Hereward, the post-1066 freedom fighter, as last of the Saxons, the epitome of manly English resistance to tyrannous French invaders. Kingsley and Freeman were as much polemicists as Gildas or Bede were. B. The importance of leadership, and a culture of Germanic military leadership. The various small kingdoms in post-Roman Germanic England of the 6th and 7th centuries owed their names to the assorted divisions of the Anglian, Saxon, and Jutish peoples settled in the Danish peninsula and the swamps of northwestern Germany in the 5th century. The three invading peoples of the mid-5th century, as recorded by Bede. In fact, it is not clear whether there was a clear genetic or geographical distinction between them. Did the Jutes come from Jutland, and where precisely was the Angles' homeland? Was it the geographical angle between Germany and the Jutland Peninsula, that is, modern Schleswig-Holstein? What of the 6th century Eastern Roman account of the Frisons, presumably from the Frisian island off Holland, were involved in the conquest? Was this another name for one of Bede's peoples, or for those Saxons not genetically or culturally distinct from the mainlanders who happened to live on the Frisian islands? Were a distinct Frisian people swamped by numerically superior and more culturally aggressive Saxons and forgotten about by later writers? What of the archaeological evidence of close cultural links between the Jutes of Kent and the Franks, seemingly ignored by Bede? The question arises of whether the names that we know the new kingdoms by are an accurate memory of the genetic or cultural makeup of the inhabitants, or just shorthand for the self-perceived allegiance of their leadership. The names may reflect the self-perceived identity of the dominant people in an area by the time of Bede, not that of the real-life 5th and 6th century settlers. What he recorded may be myth as much as accurate fact, and at least be distorted by simplification by later generations after the alleged settlement. Given the recent discoveries about the makeup of English DNA, of which more later, the extent of an influx of settlers from across the North Sea has been questioned. So has the dating of any influx of German, Low Countries DNA. How much of what has been traced was pre-Roman, from the so-called Iron Age, when Caesar testifies that some of the tribal Belgae from northern Gaul moved into southern Britain? Did the identity of Angles, Saxons, and Jutes reflect the chosen creation myths of the ruling families of family, as recorded by their poets, at the expense of a more muddled and multi-ethnic origin for their followers? So-called tribal identities in post-Roman Europe were sometimes not ethnically monolithic, but considered of a mixture of warriors and their womenfolk from different regions coalescing around a successful leader. Romans and Germans served in the Asian elite around Attila, for example. Did this apply to England too? Were all the emergent kingdoms as ethnically muddled as that of Attila, which was once assumed to be monolithically of Mongolian stock that had migrated all the way from the borders of China? It is not now certain that they were the Xiongnu Mongolian raiders of Han China in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, who had been defeated by the Chinese and were assumed to have migrated all the way to the Black Sea by the time they defeated the Goths there in the early 370s. By the same definition, some of the German groups in southeastern England may have been partly British, hence the Romano-British names of the West Saxon founder, Cerdic, and some of his kin and of the royal house of Lindsey in Lincolnshire. Both kingdoms had capitals, that is, principal royal residences and bishoprics, in former Romano-British regional capitals, Winchester and Lincoln. 5th and 6th century ethnicity is a historical and political minefield, and all that can be said is that the initial approaches of 19th century historians were too simplistic and were often influenced by their own contemporary notions of nationhood. Indeed, nowadays, some historians even think that the long-cherished differences between archaeological finds for Romano-British and Germanic peoples, grave goods, and methods of burial in particular, reflect cultural fashion as much as ethnicity. Given the likely mixture of ethnic origin for the populace of some kingdoms, were these so-called Saxon territories ever settled exclusively by people from Saxony, that is, Old Saxony in lower northwest Germany, or the Jutish territories from Jutland? And how and why did the name of the Frisians, Frissones, become submerged in those of Angles, Saxons, and Jutes? Creating a sense of identity was important, and the emergence of patriotic legends of identity focusing on a dynasty can be seen in the example of the most successful people of the later 4th and 5th centuries, the Goths. The Gothic history, Getica, of Jordanes, reflects their self-image by circa 500 and is centered on the Amal dynasty. The semi-Romanized Goths in conquered Italy are the most visible sign of this tendency, but it seems to apply across many other peoples, as in England with the founding myths of Kent, centered on Hengist, and the Anglian Mercians, centered on their continental ancestor, King Offa. Crucially, when all this dynastic mythology was created, no ambitious literary spinner for a new post-Roman kingship could create a history of ancient ruling royal families who had held power for centuries, giving an impression of antiquity and stability. The post-Roman kingship of the Germanic states in ex-Roman lands was new, and everyone knew it, though some lengthy dynastic history was to be created for non-Roman Denmark by Saxo Grammaticus. The creation of any similar foundation myths and heroic sagas for the English states is more problematic, but it would seem that Hengist in Kent, not even a definitively historical character, benefited from this. Possibly the arrival and battles of Cerdic, founder of the West Saxon kingdom, had a similar heroic saga created about it, and this was used by the compilers of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle nearly 400 years later. Given the limited extent of lay literacy in 6th to 9th century England, these stories may have been orally preserved and possibly embellished. The contrast between post-Roman Britain and post-Roman Gaul is unclear, but the survival of sub-Roman Latinate names for the local Gallic 6th century aristocracy and its control of church offices is apparent. So is literary culture. For Gaul, we have the detailed and erudite historical work of Bishop Gregory of Tours. But for Britain, we have the vague and often obscure Jeremiad of the monk Gildas, whose personal data and location are uncertain.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?